The method of raising that
thank
money.
you.
And you've discussed many different options.
Sure.
Where are you now?
Okay, so when we passed, again, Act 64, the Vermont Clean Water Act in 2015, one of the strengths of that bill was that we had a motto, basically, it was everybody in. So regardless of what kind of land you're talking about, farmland, forest land, municipal land, residential land, industrial land, everybody is part of the rules and regulations because water falls everywhere. The ideal is that wherever water landed would just soak into the ground. We wouldn't have runoff, but that's not realistic. We do have runoff. So the rules, regulations, the program addresses rain in all those places. And in order to fund that work, we're looking at a broad-based tax that has a natural connection to the work we need to do. And since it's land that is the basis of needing to do work, we're looking at a per parcel fee as a baseline contribution from every landowner towards clean water work. And that's sometimes you hear about a per parcel fee. The bill proposes to get the conversation started, a fee of $40 a year per parcel. There are 360,000 parcels in the state of Vermont. That raises roughly $13 million, so it's a big chunk of the gap we would need to fill. It could, I think we don't need to set that now, but we need to have figured out the mechanism whereby we would set it at a proper level and then administer it, collect it, distribute it. There are other proposals out there. People have floated out the notion of if phosphorus is a problem, why don't we tax phosphorus? You know, we said smoking was a problem, so we taxed cigarettes to discourage people from smoking. I don't think it's a very good analogy. Phosphorus, as Harvey said, is an essential element. We have plenty of phosphorus in us, and it's, I don't know that smoking is necessarily a great comparison. But at any rate, some people have said, well, people would be more careful about using it, not over applying it, stuff like that, if it were taxed. I don't know that that proposal is going anywhere, but that has been floated out. Other people have said one of the ways you might raise money is a tax on rooms. So, you know, we have many tourists who come here, they enjoy the natural environment. Would we ask them to help chip in and pay an extra $1 a night when they're staying someplace? And that money would go to it. So there's no shortage of ideas, but the baseline that's, I think, a broad-based tax that I think we will start with as a foundation is asking a modest amount from everyone to help contribute to clean water, since it's an essential thing for everybody. Other taxes will get proposed, but I don't think that'll be, for the most part, till next year.
Okay, the microphones are open for questions, comments. Yes, Senator Ayer.
I couldn't help but feeling like Yogi Berra when I was listening to this conversation with deja vu all over again. And it's because as I look around the room, I've worked with at least 4 of you in the early 1990s. We had the same conversation. We said the same thing about farming and phosphorus and soils and water temperature and so on. And here we still are. We really have not made much progress. And I think it's time, and I can't understand, knowing the number of farmers and farm operations that I did know, and the good job they were doing, and the hard work they were making, the progress they were making on keeping soil erosion to a minimum and using as little phosphorus as they do, that they don't want to talk about it. They don't want anybody looking at their records. They don't want anybody measuring stuff from their tile drains. And most farmers I know do a really good job. I see you shaking your head, Tim, and it's the same thing you did 20 years ago. But still, it's if we are doing such a good job on our farms, I think people aren't getting credit for it. And if we aren't, then we need to put more into it. There's a lot that could be done. And with the prices of milk, maybe we need to figure out how else we can support farmers instead of just helping them, facilitating phosphorus runoff by the laws that we make.
Other questions? Terry.
I'm just speaking more as a citizen, but I work in the summer on the Fort Dye Ferry, and my boss and I lived here pretty much all our lives. And quite often we say this is the cleanest we've seen the lake. It's never going to be blue because there's suspended clay in this area. I mean, I'm not sure what goes on at the rest of the lake up there, but in Shoreham and Orwell, that clay is just bound in the summer, makes it look kind of gray and green. And if you go down there ice fishing and dip out the water, it looks perfectly clear. A lot of that has to do with sediment on the bottom, not necessarily manure. It's just clay deposits from the side of the banks.
Thank you, Terry.
Hi, I'm Bob Zelo, Bridport. I've got two questions. One, I suspect somebody knows what the phosphate level in the lake is now, and is that improving or getting worse? Is what we're doing now working a bit? The second question is, I've heard a lot about phosphate recapture, and I was talking to one of my neighbors, and they're talking about putting in a system to do that. And I've also read in another article somewhere, I'm not sure where, that phosphate recovering on such a distributed small scale level is not economic. So could somebody address those two questions?
Well, that's pretty broad. The TMDL was set with models, and so any reduction practices are based on models. So
you might just explain what TMDL stands for.
total maximum daily load. That's how you measure what's in the lake, and we do need to reduce that to meet the EPA standards. And we have a number of practices that were set up in this modeling effort that we went through when we were developing Act 64, not 46. Act 64. And we were kind of moving forward with blind faith, because as EPA and the state agencies were working out what the TMDL was, we're in the legislature passing legislation to meet these goals. And we didn't really understand or know exactly what the goals were, but we knew that we needed to move forward with this, and if they were working on it, we had some level of faith that we were going to be able to achieve that goal. So every practice, so the cover cropping is one, and I don't know what the coefficients are for measuring that, but if you put in cover cropping so that we're keeping that ground covered year round, we've met part of that goal, and they're based on the modeling. So we don't have a measuring stick where we can go out and measure the phosphorus that's leaving any individual farm and going into the lake, or any road project, or any driveway, or any roof runoff that's taking place. We don't have a way really to measuring that. There is a process now, and we've been doing it for the last 2 or 3 years, depending on the watershed we're in. But up in the Franklin County area, they've been doing tile measurements, so they've been measuring the water that's coming out of the tile, so they know what that is, and they're testing for phosphorus, they're testing for flow, and they're doing this on a pretty regular basis. Champlain Valley Basin, we've just started a program. I think they've already started sampling now. And it's the same thing. We're trying to find out what is actually coming out of the ground. And then once we know what's coming out of those tiles, then we can adjust farm management practices. So maybe we do away with moldboard tilling and go to no till or minimum till to plant and grow our crops and regenerate that growth. And that's what we need. We don't have a lot of science on this. The only project for really testing water is over at Mining Institute, and they've been through 2 years of testing now, and it's coming out fairly positive that tile isn't a big contributor. The surface runoff from a rain event, if you had a field that wasn't covered, with vegetation on a regular basis, you'd see a lot more phosphorus coming off the surface than you would consistently coming out of the tile. The other thing we found is the tile drains, they don't run all the time. And once you get the water table down to where you can grow a decent crop and build up more organic matter in the surface of the soil, then you start seeing less phosphorus coming out. So it's a combination of things, but I will tell you that study is really looking pretty good, and they're going to be looking at changing management practices too, how much manure to apply, what happens when you put a cover crop into that mix. But we don't have a lot of those answers now to make good decisions, so we're asking for some time and some patience in order to come to some real good, sound data.
Thank you, Harvey. Just a reminder for those of you who may have just joined us, move to the microphone if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. It makes for much better television if you're at a microphone and people can actually hear you. Senator Bray.
I just wanted to add a little more on in terms of the scope of the challenge. So every year, approximately 1.5 million pounds of phosphorus flows into Lake Champlain. And under the TMDL, we're trying to reduce that amount by about roughly 500,000 pounds. So often you hear this stuff quoted in metric tons, and I have trouble thinking in metric tons. Pounds works better for me. So the 213 metric tons you often hear about is roughly 500,000 pounds. And that kind of reduction is to put that in scale in terms of why this is going to be a long-term challenge. Every county in the state of Vermont, there's a UVM research on net phosphorus balance. Sometimes people call it mass balance. How much, basically, if Vermont's a county by county, if each county's a bathtub, are you putting in more phosphorus than is leaving, since phosphorus leaves in the form of food and milk, for instance, cheese. And it turns out that every county's in net excess, so we're adding more than leaves, and we've been doing that for at least a half a century. The scale of what we're trying to reduce, that roughly 500,000 pounds a year, we've put in, the excess is 1,000-fold that over the last 50 years. So when people talk about legacy phosphorus, we are talking about a huge amount of phosphorus put in over a half century or more. And that's why it's going to be, I was coming back to that word earlier, a steady, consistent effort, because we have a lot of lifting to do. The good news is we don't have to address all that. The phosphorus that settles onto the bottom actually becomes, for the most part, stable and isn't available to come back up. It's only the upper layer of that sediment that sometimes is sort of released and helps kick off an algae bloom.
Thank you. We have a number of people moving to the microphone, but I think you're next. Yeah.
Yes, my name's Gary Pomainville. I'm from Lincoln. I'm not a farmer, but most of my relatives were. I just want to say that I do support a broad-based assessment against pricing as a basic way to start to fund this. The real question I have, though, is I'd like an update on the tax reform, if I could get that.
All right, before we move to the tax reform, does anybody want to finish up the phosphorus issue? Yes.
I'd like to repeat my question because it wasn't answered. Maybe it can't be answered. I asked, is the quantity of phosphate getting better or worse? And I understand there's all these point sources, but hasn't somebody done, 100 samples across the lake and measured that? And last year, this year, 20 years ago, are we adding more, or are we actually, what we've done so far, slowing it down or stopping it? The second part of the question is there's been talk about phosphate recovery as one of the tools. One of my neighbors is considering doing that. And I've heard that it's a good idea. Obviously, capturing it is a good idea. But I've also heard that it's not economic, because even with the large farms, the economics of cost of capture versus the value of the captured phosphate is not economic. Those are the two questions. Are we actually getting better or worse? And is phosphate recapture a economically viable, solution?
Thank you for repeating. Now I'll remember them. So we had Secretary Moore, Agency of Natural Resources Secretary, and I said, although we know there's some bright spots in terms of practices that are improving water quality in spots, overall, is water quality improving, staying the same, or getting worse each year? And the sobering and troubling answer was that it continues to decline. So, we're referring to it as an elevator that has a certain amount of momentum on its way down, and we're doing everything we can to stop that and then send it back the other direction. In terms of phosphorus recovery, the governor has proposed, I think, $300,000 to be put out to competitive bids to have people explore phosphorus recovery from manure, so that less would end up being spread in the land or injected. And so we all have more to learn about it. It's not an industrial scale answer yet. It may be someday, and I think what he's trying to do is stimulate some entrepreneurial activity to look into it. But and it's not cost effective compared to buying those minerals in the market, the commodity marketplace, because they're actually quite cheap and it's quite expensive to recover them.
Harvey, did you want to make another comment?
Yes. To the question about are we making progress in a positive way, the answer is yes, based on the modeling that I talked about. If we incorporate those agricultural practices to reduce phosphorus, and these models were agreed upon by the Agency of Agriculture, the state ANR, and Agency of Natural Resources, and the EPA, and probably there's some other groups in there as well. And if we're following and achieving those goals that are set up in that modeling, we should be moving in the right direction. As far as the phosphorus recovery goes, the governor is asking for $1.6 million in a program to work with a few farmers, and I forgot now what the amount was, but $300,000 to $500,000 a piece in order to accomplish that goal of recovering, recapturing, and maybe moving some of that phosphorus out of the watershed instead of importing it like we have in the past. So the answer is kind of yes to those. I have somebody handed me a question. What is the name of the study you mentioned? Are you talking about the minor that I mentioned? Yeah, it's just if you went onto the Minor Institute's website and typed in tile study, I'm sure it would come up. And the information is readily available. And what would enable farms to go to no-till? Do we have farmers doing no-till? I'll let them speak to that, but we're doing an incredible amount of no-till in the state. It's really taken off and it's showing some real progress, and actually that's kind of the basis for this regenerative agriculture bill that we're working on. It's to build up the organic matter and soil tilt and all the different microorganisms that are working in the soil to build healthy soils, and it goes hand in hand with the no-till that's already taken place.
Okay, so we are going to move to tax reform unless there's a comment on. Go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Jennifer Hall. I own a dairy farm here with my father and my brother in Orwell. We are members of the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, and they asked us to speak today as a member of the coalition. So, excuse the glasses, I can't see you with them off and I can't see my notes with them on. Okay, so I've just been taking down a bunch of notes while I've been listening to everybody's comments. And so several of us that are in the room here today met last Monday at this exact same place. There's still some notes on the board back there, or the wall. The United States Department of Agriculture, along with NRCS, UVM Extension, and the Farm Service Agency, or FSA, as well as interested parties, and almost 50% attendance was in farmers in this local area, met to begin developing a plan for the East Creek watershed into Lake Champlain to specifically address some of these issues that we're talking about today. We came up with several areas that need to be worked on or discussed. Those areas are funding for technical assistance. Technical assistance is money that is given to people in agriculture that are trying to make improvements to their land to meet some of these areas, to decrease the phosphorus, to implement no-tilling or cover cropping, a wide variety of subjects. FA, or farmer assistance, straight up money is needed to help anybody in agriculture these days. Oh, I am not going to get this done in 2 minutes. A number I wanted to throw out to you, and I feel like I got to rush here, was speaking to a neighboring farm within the last month. They milk approximately 400 cows. The cost of production to break even every day is around $20, and I'm throwing out rough numbers here, okay? I'm not a statistician, not an expert. So about $20 a hundredweight to break even, and they're getting about 15. That is equating to approximately a $30,000 to a $35,000 per month loss based on, and that information is from their meeting with Farm Credit. Organic milk prices are also on the decline. Currently looking at a base of about $32 a hundredweight, which is equal to a 2006 price. Obviously, whether you're conventional or organic, those prices have gone up every year. Rough math, that's about $7,500 per month in deficit. If you want agriculture to do its part in cleaning up the lake, straight up, there's got to be some money. My time is up. I have about 12,000 more things to talk about, but thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Rachel Orr, and I think I can pick up kind of where Jen left off. So my family has a farm here in Orwell, and I feel very strongly that some of you don't realize what we are doing to clean up the lake. I take responsibility. I have water that pollutes the lake. You have water, so we all have a part, okay? So I guess where I'm coming from is we're done pointing fingers. I take responsibility, but what I want you guys to know is what we are doing. So we have nutrient management plans. We take a soil test. We implement practices. How many of you guys know what cover crops are? Can you please raise your hand? Okay. How many know what injection of manure is? Great. How many people want to see farms in this county? Great, I do too. Okay? So I think what we can come to is we all care about the farming community. I care about you guys. Hopefully you care about me. If you don't, that's okay. But what I'm going to say is we have nutrient management plans. We're implementing practices on our farm. For example, we've done no-till corn, cover crops. I have a nutrient management plan. We implement it. We have inspections. Okay, all these things are pretty rattling because we don't make a lot of money. And if we're out of compliance, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for me. It's a big deal for my father. And we care. So I guess I didn't take any notes. I was gonna write something, but I was boiling sap last night. So basically I'm winging it. But what I'm saying is, if you're interested, I would like everyone to take my number right now. And if you have questions, I want you to call me. I want you to reach out to Jen. I want you to reach out to Brian Kemp. I'm a member of the Farmer Coalition, and we care. There's a group of us that sit in a room every month, and we care. So if you want my number, it's 802-989-9467, and I hope you will reach out if you have questions. So if you have questions, give me a call or talk to Jen or Brian.
Thank you very much, and we do care about farmers.
I wanted to, money has come up, of course, in terms of level of support to help a transition to a healthier model, I'd say, in terms of impacts on environmental impacts related to agriculture. And we could always spend more, but Vermont has a lot of priorities, and so ag competes with many other things. So I'd say the state has, I want this to invested, I would say, in keeping our working landscape a working landscape. So we have use value appraisal or current use program, sometimes people refer to it, to do roughly an 80 to 90% tax liability reduction. We have sales exemptions for, sales tax exemptions for many things that go into farming and forestry, and there are quite a few permit requirements and development permit requirements that we don't apply to agriculture. So there's a whole suite of practices that are related to supporting agriculture. And I think the state has, for a long time, really put its money where its mouth is. Maybe not as much as people would like, but again, we come back to we're always, we're competing with things like, can we keep roads and bridges up to or our schools up to the level that people would like them. So I'd say, but underneath it all is the troubling change over time in terms of what Americans spend on food. And it was sort of a good news, bad news story. Roughly 25 years ago, food costs in a household were on average somewhere around 20% of a household budget. And today they're down to around 2%. And what's shifted in that same time frame is that healthcare costs used to be around 2%, and now they're around 20%. So farmers are getting far less money for the food they're producing, and we're spending far less money for it. You could say, well, that's a great efficiency story, but it also means that it is harder and harder with each passing year to make a living in agriculture. And that, I think, is the fundamental pressure that everyone in agriculture lives under, is being pressed to do more each year while income is squeezed ever tighter.
All good points, and I thank you all for that discussion. Shall we move to tax reform? Since you did mention current use and other things that are involved in tax reform. Peter?
Good morning. My name is Peter Conlon. I'm representative from the Addison 2 district. I can speak to, I think, probably what's been in the news about tax reform, but not all of it. And this is a proposed change in the education property tax. The House Ways and Means Committee last week or the week before passed out a tax bill, and probably the biggest part of it is this change in education taxes. And it would essentially shift $59 million in property taxes, and this is all education property taxes, from the property tax to the income tax. Now, when you think that we spend about $1.3 billion on public education, pre-K to 12, $59 million is not a big number in that huge sphere. But this would result in about a 15-cent decrease in the property taxes on average statewide for your house and 2 acres. That $59 million would be shifted to the income tax in a sort of a small, graduated, progressive way. And in fact, I think one statistic was that about 85% of this $59 million would be shouldered by those making $100,000 or more. It's got some other provisions. I know that in the district where I live, the Addison Central School District, it would actually be about a 13-cent decrease, not a 15-cent decrease. It really depends on how much you spend per pupil on your education. This is in the first year of implementation. There's kind of a upward going graph that benefit would decrease as it's fully implemented. And a lot of that is based on what your community spends per pupil. And that actually, as you spend more, at a certain point when the program's fully implemented, you actually get nicked a little bit in your overall tax burden if you're in the $17,000 to $20,000 per pupil per year area. But in the first year, everybody, at least on a property tax area, would benefit in every district. And like I said, the shift, the $59 million shift is a somewhat policy number and somewhat a political number. They had to pick a number. But a lot of it is based on what those who are benefiting most from the federal income tax changes, making those adjustments in a way that takes that into account. So this bill has passed the House Ways and Means Committee. It's stopping by the House Education Committee, which is where I sit. We're more education folks and not tax folks. So we're looking at some of the educational impacts. And then, of course, it has to go through the whole rest of the process.
Harvey.
Yes, that kind of covers the education funding part of the tax changes, but what they're also talking about is income tax changes, and this is all in the same bill that was just spoken to, was reduces the state burden on Vermonters who are adversely impacted by the change in the federal tax law, and we lost about $30 million from that. But it lowers taxes for Vermonters. It lowers all income tax rate by 0.2%. And it creates a standard deduction equal to $6,000 per individual or $12,000 for joint filing. It expands the Vermont income tax credit from 32% to 35%, and it creates a 5% credit for those who contribute $10,000 to charitable causes. So somebody that contributed $10,000 could get a $500 tax credit on their tax bill. So those are some of the other changes that have taken place as well.
Okay, 10,000 is a lot of money to be given away. Other questions or comments? Step right up.
Seems to be my day, I don't know. I've been reading about this new tax bill, and the devil is in the details on all these things with the current tax, education tax, property tax we have, and this new. But I'm trying to, without all those details on the new bill, and maybe the legislators have seen a lot more details than I have. I only have the media to look at. But in today's world, we know what our property taxes are. I mean, there's the state grand list that's normalized. We know we know how much money is available there. And on the income tax side, we pretty much know that as well. And to date, we have, whether you like it or not, probably one of the most progressive property tax systems going because of the pre-break process. So that is income adjusted quite well. I'm not sure whether we're first in the nation, but we're among the first as far as equitable property taxes. Now going to this new so-called income tax basis, I mean, I think it's a little bit of eyewash because we're dealing with the same pool of money. We're going to shift things around, stir things all up, and with the same pool, two pools, property and income, and just have a new set of winners and a new set of losers. I mean, it's all just effort. In my mind, I don't see any real benefit there until you actually publish the details on who the winners are and who the losers are. I think if we're really worried about our taxes, and I don't like paying property taxes like anybody else, but that's not fun, is we need to look at a new source of taxes if we want our property taxes to go down. and we want our income taxes maybe to go down. And that is this wealth concept. And I think I've mentioned this before, back in the 1800s, 1700s, all wealth was in property. That's why it was property taxes. Cows were taxed, you know, houses were taxed, horses were taxed, property tax. Then in the Industrial Revolution, people got paid wages. And so when they looked for more equitable tax, they added income tax. Now we have an era of venture capitalists, private capital, hedge funds managers moving taxes to all kinds of shelters. And we have trillions of dollars that is fairly lightly taxed. On your house, you pay every year on that value, and then when you sell it, you pay capital gains. When a hedge fund manager has $1 billion in his account, he doesn't pay anything when it's sitting there. He only pays 10% when he makes money on it. And we're not addressing that. We need to look at taxing this other reservoir of wealth that we're not doing now. And I know it's hard. You need to get academics and economists involved to map that out. But only the legislators can make that happen. So I'm suggesting let's not just make change for change's sake, because it's just going to make a lot of bureaucratic stuff. The tax preparers will go crazy, and a new set of winners and losers will happen. We need, if we want to lower the taxes, we need to look and tax this other form of wealth.
So I'll just say that your basic point is correct. This change does not change the amount of money that is being raised, because essentially this is money that goes into the education fund. The education fund is a self-balancing fund. It's what's used to fund our public schools. And the amount that is raised in the education fund isn't set at the state level, it's set at the local level. The state simply raises the amount of money that all of the voters decide they're going to spend locally. So collectively, when we go to vote on our school budgets, we come up with the total amount of there is about $1.3 billion. And a fair amount of that comes from the federal government, a fair amount of that comes from the non-residential property tax, and a fair amount of that comes from a lot of other broad-based taxes, and then another fair amount comes from the homestead property tax. So what is raised is exactly the amount that is spent. The effort here, I think, was, and it's originated in a different committee, but the effort here was really to answer Vermonters' concerns about property tax rates, to figure out a new way of shifting it. There was a much more comprehensive plan that would have gotten rid of the income sensitivity portion of things. It's also there to address a somewhat complex inequity we have among school districts, where low spending per pupil wise districts are actually subsidizing to a certain extent higher spending ones. If you think about the state kind of giving a base amount in theory of, let's say, $13,000 per kid, and your town spends $14,000, and your neighboring district spends $17,000, that difference is actually the lower spending district, because we're all contributing to a statewide fund at a statewide property tax rate, is actually subsidizing that higher spending district to a certain extent. So again, this does not address spending. It simply addresses how much is being raised. The decisions on addressing spending is really a local decision still.
Yes, in this bill that we're talking about, it actually repeals the excess spending penalty that's currently in place. So maybe we should be having a discussion about how can we be more efficient in what we're delivering for programs and lower the cost of the state, because we are a very high tax state, and so we're going to have to take a look at putting some brakes on.
Terry?
On the point about taxing wealth, Governor Scott has been trying to keep people in Vermont and bring people back. I just can't imagine the caravan of wealthy people that would be leaving this state if we start taxing their 401ks and IRAs?
Hi, my name's Wayne Hall. I live in Orwell. Guy I used to work with in the early 80s. He was a farm boy that grew up in Georgia, Vermont, moved to Connecticut, worked there for 10 years, moved back, worked with him for a while. He started a business, and he's getting ready to retire. Actually, he is retired, and he's talking about moving out of state now because of the taxation rate on Social Security and our retirement income. I'm not sure, I heard a lot of numbers, I'm not sure how that's being addressed in this tax bill. I hope to retire in 3 years when I'm 70. I don't plan on leaving, whether it's affordable or not to live here, but I would hope there's some tax relief for older folks. Well, not me yet, I hope, but less taxation on our retirement and our Social Security. He's talking about moving out of state, moving south to a state that doesn't tax that income. Is there any talk about that with this tax bill?
Harvey.
Yeah, actually, I didn't get far enough down my script sheet here, but there is a proposal to eliminate the taxes on Social Security for single files at $45,000 and let's see, $60,000 for joint filers. 100% elimination of that state tax.
Please vote yes then.
So who's getting 45,000 on Social Security?
Yeah, right. Well, it's all income.
I think the next is around about 30,000. Yeah.
Spence Putnam from Weybridge. Well, there's another approach to taxes, and that is finding programs that can actually save us money. And I'm interested, Claire, you mentioned earlier that there's certain topics that have gone on for 20, 30 years. But I think there's real potential in the universal primary care bill to reduce our expenditures on medical expenses. So can you talk about what progress has been made there and what your hopes are for that?
Sure. Thank you. I always like talking about health care. We have passed a bill for universal primary care out of Senate Health and Welfare. It has to stop in appropriations and in finance because there are certain funds in place. It's a bill that, well, first of all, let's back up. There's only one specific set of practices that are shown to be cost effective in controlling how much we spend for health care, and that is unfettered access to primary care. Every other country in the world, of the 35 most well-developed economic countries in the world, we rank ourselves in tax policy, environmental things, violence. Healthcare is one of those things where we keep a lot of indicators. All of those countries have free primary care. It's not free, you pay taxes for it, but access to primary care. They all have better health indicators than we do in almost every aspect, except for a breast cancer treatment, interestingly enough, and maybe one or two others. And we also know from work that's happened here in the United States what happens when you have free access to primary care or no copays and deductibles access to primary care, that things like emergency room visits go down, that life expectancy goes up, that sort of thing. I can't say that it's cost savings, though. There's a difference between cost savings and cost effectiveness. If you want to talk about cost savings, there are only about 5 medical practices that actually save money. One is vaccines, one is counseling to take aspirin for adults, one is counseling for alcohol and substance abuse, and one is counseling for safe driving. All the others are called cost effectiveness, and that means that the cost of the measure over time is less than the cost of the consequences of not doing it over time. So if you run the math out, I'm confident that if Vermonters had access to primary care, and even though we're very highly insured as a state, 95, 97%, there are deductibles and copays that cause people to say, I'm going to have to try this next week, or I can put up with this for another couple of weeks. And where they end up is in a place where in an acute condition, that cost far more than a few visits to a family doctor would have cost for blood pressure checks or looking at infections or heart disease or whatever. And that's a theory that holds true across all of our healthcare. There are a few things that we spend most of our money on. There are chronic conditions, like chronic lung disease, high blood pressure, cardiac issues caused by that. That's where most of our money is going, because all of the many of the acute diseases that were suffered in our parents' generation are no longer an issue. Where the money is spent now is chronic disease in hospital settings. Primary care can really take a big bite out of that spending, and we take money that's now spent in hospitals and spend it on people. We'll live longer, we'll live better, but we won't save money in the end because we live longer. Oh, and so I'm hoping the bill will get out of 2 committees this coming week and go to the floor.
More questions, comments, answers?
This is on healthcare issue. One of the things that's never been talked about much at the state or federal level was that really the cost wasn't going to go down, and everybody knew it. It was going to go up because we needed the jobs. We had lost manufacturing. We had lost housing. We needed healthcare jobs in the state, and we got a lot of them. But it wasn't going to put the cost down. It was going to keep it going up. And it still will. Thank you.
Senator Ayer.
I have to agree with Mr. Permainville that the cost of health care probably won't go down, ever. But what we have right now, or we had increases of up to 20% in the 70s and 80s, and that's leveled off to 4 or 5%. But 3 or 4% of $5.5–6 billion is a lot of money. We could do a lot with that, with the excess. What it will do, instead of having it go up like this, is it'll go up much less quickly. And our ideal is that it would go up at the rate of inflation. Healthcare inflation has always been much higher than the average rate of inflation. But that is, I don't know if you've heard of something called the ACO, something called One Care. It's a program that's taking on some risks, saying we can take care of all this group, and they'll look and see how old you are, and if you smoke, if you're overweight, if you run every day. So I can take care of all these people for so much ahead. And they guarantee to do that, keep the profit if they can, and take the risk if they can't. And the idea, their risk is saying we can control the inflation, healthcare inflation, to 3.5%. So we'll see if they can do it. They've got 125,000 lives right now in their program. And I think it's our best hope right now for controlling costs is looking at large groups and saying, and trying to keep them healthy. The way they're going to do that is to provide primary care and hope that they don't get their people in the hospital, where it does cost a lot of money. In terms of jobs, we have that Mr. Permainville is absolutely dead on right, but we have a real workforce shortage in healthcare right now. We don't have enough, even though it's and I don't think I want to get sick or not be insured so that you could have a job. I can't imagine that anybody thinks that way.
Yeah, there are many job openings.
Oh, yes.
In the healthcare field.
And we're going to have to pay for it.
And yes, you are at the new minimum wage.
I don't know very many people in healthcare that work at minimum wage.
You're invited over. You can start. I mean, a lot of folks would have that conversation, but at any rate, you're right. So I had a quick question on the accountable care organizations. Just to clarify that, when you said ACO, is there one or are there many of them? Is UVM the only one?
There are at least 3. There's one that's at a high function level. The FQHCs, the Federally Qualified Healthcare Centers, the Bernie Community Centers formed an accountable care organization, but they're not taking on any contracts or anything like that. And there was a group of independent docs who all got together and formed their own accountable care organization. and the math didn't work for them. So the only one that's functioning that I know of is in out of Burlington, One Care, but they're an old concept. It's not a new thing.
And they are how does the organization get picked to care for that 130,000 people?
It was originally there was the feds offered sort of I'll put out requests for proposals, requests for a bid to do to run an ACO, because they're looking for ways that we can save money and still give good care, right, at the federal level. There were 3 bidders, and those were the 3 ACOs that I talked to you about: the community health care centers, the independent docs, and One Care, which is where Porter is right now, UVM. So was that the question?
Yes, it was.
Yes, okay.
Thank you. Other questions on any topic? Yes.
Every time I come to one of these, I swear I'm not going to say a word, and then I get hooked. I'd like to revisit the tax issue again. It really concerns me, and I served 7 terms in the legislature. It really concerns me, House Ways and Means. One day they were talking about a proposal of 50% reduction in property tax and an offsetting amount of income tax. The next day, 1 day later, they come out with a surcharge, 5% or 10%, a completely different bill, and passed it. I think 10-1, maybe, folks, 9-2, whatever it was. I don't think it was baked. I think it's half baked, and I think people just do not have a sense. I'm a banker in my profession. The complexity of this issue, of a reduction in this, an increase in that, its impact on bringing jobs to Vermont, its impact on people who are going to leave Vermont. It is a hugely, hugely involved question that needs more than a cursory shot through the legislature. I've got to beg of you to think about what its impacts are going to have. When I was there, we decided that I was in the legislature that passed the statewide property tax for education. One of the reasons I voted for that bill was because it took care of the funding of current use. Keeping lands open in the state of Vermont was everybody's responsibility. So to me, it made sense to have a statewide property tax. We never should have given that tax source to the state of Vermont, because we've done everything with that other than fund education. Every time we talk about a new ed formula, it's because the legislature hasn't kept up its end of the bargain. And we're there again right now. Property tax is getting so high that people are going to start saying no. So we contrive, and I've done it, I've been in the legislature, we've done it many, many times. Smoke and mirrors, we change the plan. We'll give you a reduction in your property tax, and they're asking us to give them the income tax. No. Never thought I would say this. I'm 7th generation Orwell. I'm proud to be from Orwell, 7 generations. And I got to tell you, I'm one of those folks, haven't done it, it's going to hurt. I own a house in Florida. I own a vehicle in Florida. I have bank accounts in Florida. For me to change my residency is like pretty simple. And I'm really contemplating that, because everything that's happened in the legislature this year, debt collection affects my bank, taxes affect me. Everything affects me in one way or another, and it's not in a good way. Please slow things down and think about their effect on the Vermont economy. Thank you.
Okay.
Just a quick response. The timing of that was actually, it was a weekend that went by. But the concept that came out was not the original concept that was going to come out, probably because they heard a lot of folks like Mark say that this radical change was going to be challenging. What did come out had been part of the conversation going into, they spent really up until last week, from the start of the legislative session up until last week, which is, many weeks, discussing what formula would work best. I think it's a little bit of a disservice to call it half-baked. Just in terms of those taxes and sort of laying it on the state, I'm going to push back a little bit and say that we're talking about education taxes here. Education spending is not decided at the state level. The state simply acts as the collection point for all of the decisions that are made locally. These are local decisions on how much to spend on education. The state is in charge of raising that money to pay for it, but it does not decide what the school districts pay.
And to that point, Peter, I know that there was scary talk about how much the education tax is going to go up 9 cents or something like that. And that was based on projections of what the local districts were likely to spend on their schools. And can you verify that, in fact, the actual budgets that were passed, with 5 exceptions, were much lower than that projection? In other words, local school boards are putting the brakes on.
Yeah, so when we heard about the 9-cent property tax increase that was being projected, about half of that was based on the money that the legislature turned back to voters. There was a surplus in the education fund of about $45 million, and the legislature last year, instead of sort of carrying it over, simply returned it in the form of property tax relief in the last legislative session. And then you're quite right that the projection was going to be that school districts were going to increase their spending by 3.5% in the budgets that are currently, or that were just approved last week. And they actually came in far less than that. I think it was about 1.7%, and the actual per pupil spending was up even less. So it came in well under projection, and so the warnings about what the property tax rates were going to go up are actually coming in significantly less. It's not going down, but the increases are coming in less than projected.
I just wanted to add on a little. So the proposal that's being discussed, as has been referenced, has just come out of Ways and Means. It has ways to travel through other committees and then to the House floor, then over to the Senate, where really the process starts all over again. So who knows exactly where we'll end up. But I think I just wanted to rise in appreciation for what Mark was sharing. And I think, and that is sometimes I think the legislature undervalues stability, that we can be too often drawn to changing things, and it has implications throughout the state, and they can be expensive and confusing and sometimes discouraging. So I hope that we'll be cautious as we do any kind of tax reform, and I'll look forward to seeing what it looks like when it comes through on the Senate side.
Cool. More questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Brian Kemp, and I'd just like to go back to the water quality thing and touch on a few other things that my constituents, Jen and Rachel, didn't have time to. There's a lot of change going on here, and water quality is at the forefront in everybody's thoughts and minds. And just to reiterate what the two of them said, it's on a farmer's mind every day. You know, farmers in the past stuck to the grindstone, they put their heads down, they stayed on the farm. We realized that hasn't worked for us. And about 4 years ago, we started an organization called the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, and originated with 12 farm members for his board of directors, and we're now up to just under 100 farm members. We feel we need a voice. We need to be heard, and we need to be part of this process. We feel like we're getting pushed around. There's bills every year forcing more and more. And as you heard from the two before me, there is no money out there. And you know, there's a lot of federal and state dollars coming in to help. Farmers still have a financial obligation there with a cost share. And as the dairy prices in particular are so low, I mean, how many people in this room are making the same price for their product that they made 30, 40 years ago? You know, just imagine that. You know, what other industry, you know, could sustain that? And somehow dairy farms, for the most part, you know, here in this county have been surviving. They've found different ways, they've diversified, they've found other models to try to do. So all I just want to finish up with is we want to be heard. Sometimes we feel like we're not in Montpelier. We don't have the time to get up there every day, to be on a committee, to speak in front of committees, but we're making efforts and we're taking venues like this, and you're going to see and hear more of us. We just feel like we're really not heard, and those invitations that we're giving you are sincere. We do want people to come to the farms, to see what we're doing, to understand what we're doing to improve water quality on our farms. It's part of our process every day now with our nutrient management plans. And, you know, we've done bus tours in the past where we've asked legislators to come, you know, and frankly, last spring, you know, we had to cancel it and move it. And we still got very few legislators to come on that bus tour. And that's frustrating. We need to be heard. We need to have a voice. And we're going to stand up for ourselves.
Thank you, Brian. We've about come to the end of our program today. I just wanted to reiterate that this legislative breakfast each Monday during the legislative session is for just what you're talking about, Brian, so that farmers and others can be heard. It's sponsored each week by the Bridport Grange and the Addison County Farm Bureau, and in order to keep that sponsorship going, you'll see a little plastic bucket there. If you want to put $1 in on your way out, we would be most appreciative. That will help keep these programs going throughout legislative sessions in the years to come, too. So thank you very much for being with us. Yes?
I want to add that Addison County, to my knowledge, is the only county that does this. The bank put on something once in a while in Rutland, and the chamber does something once in a while in Washington. But we're the only county that has a weekly opportunity to discuss issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next Monday, we're going to be not too far away. We'll be in Shoreham next Monday morning at the Platt Memorial Library on Main Street in Shoreham. Look for the library. I think it's on the left as you drive down Main Street. So we'll see you there on Monday morning at 7 o'clock. Thank you for attending.
Depends on which way you're going, Tim.
Yeah.